I would like to welcome everyone. My name is Zakaria Ul Ahmed Salim. So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Northwestern University, and I'm also the director of ISITA. So some people who joined us today might not be familiar with ISITA. ISITA is the Institute for the Study of Islamic Thought in Africa. It has been in existence since roughly 2 decades. It was created back in 2000, formally within the program of African Studies at Northwestern to explore the tradition of learning in Islamic Africa. It developed later on to become a program focused on the role of Islam in African societies in any time period. And we have had a programming that actually covers all aspects of the experiences of African Muslims over time. Lately, we have been focusing on contemporary times, but also on history, as these talks today is about the 19th and early 20th century. So we don't have a preferred time period. Whenever or wherever the experience of Muslims living in Africa is concerned, we will try to cover it in our speaker series, in our programming overall. Today we are launching a new series. We are one of those people who are reluctant to move online for the discussion series. We've been overly optimistic about the end of the pandemic, and we said we'll wait it out for a few months and we can have people, because one of the advantages of being able to run this kind of program is to meet people, and ISITA is a network organization. We very much are interested in welcoming people to our campus and having them visit our libraries, which is a premier library in African studies and Islamic studies of Africa in particular. But we finally decided, we caved, and we decided that we'll have to resume our speaker series online. And we basically this year we're organizing 6 what we call ISITA Dialogues around new books and new interventions in the field of Islam in Africa, broadly speaking. So for those of you who have had the opportunity to consult our program, it covered from 19th century to today, and we are also inviting speakers from various disciplines as it is the tradition. This is very much an interdisciplinary program. I don't want to take a lot of your time. I am going now to introduce our first speaker of this series, Nii Koney Odamtten. Harry is an associate professor, associate professor of African and Atlantic history at Santa Clara University in California. He holds a dual PhD in African American and African studies and history from Michigan State University, where he earned his PhD in 2010. Harry's research is primarily in intellectual history. He's also a social historian, and we invited him here because he has just published an important book about Blyden intellectual transformation, and that's exactly the title of the book, Transformations Plural. The subtitle is Afro-Publicanism, Pan-Africanism, Islam, and the Indigenous West African Church. And the book has been published by Michigan State University back in 2019. Harry is also an editor of the Journal of West African History. His research and publications span African and African diaspora, intellectual and social history, African American gender and women studies, Pan-Africanism, hip-hop, and public culture. He teaches courses on Africa and others at the intersection of Africa, its African diaspora, and the Atlantic diaspora. His talk today is about is a book talk, basically. So he's going to present his book's argument and material, methodology, etc. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Nii Odamtten, and I'm guessing that you can upload with virtually and welcome him. So please join me in 10 for his talk on
All right.
Harry Blyden and Blyden transformations, intellectual transformations. The floor is yours, Harry.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Zakaria Ahmed Salem, for that introduction, and also for inviting me, the Institute of for the Study of Islamic Thought in Africa, ISITA, as well as Rebecca Sherekis for making all of this happen. This has been a year in the making, but I'm here, so that's good. I also want to say a big thank you. I see a few familiar faces, Sean Hanretta and Bright Jenfi. Thank you to everyone else for coming and being a part of this presentation today. I'm going to speak a little bit about the book in general, and then I'll go specifically to my presentation for today. So please bear with me as I share my screen. All right, so I'm going to be speaking about Edward Blighting and the Africanization of Islam, which is basically the talk. It's a chapter in the book that tries to showcase Edward Blighting's contributions to the study of Islam in Africa. The book examines the sequential development of Edward Blighting's scholarly activities. It tracks key historic events and life experiences in Blighting's checkered career, which is to say, the incidents that transformed him from a diasporic Ethiopianist to a purveyor of African life and customs. Through a close reading of sources culled from multiple archives, this intellectual biography of Blighting demonstrates that a chronological rather than a thematic analysis of his enduring ideas reveal his undervalued yet influential thinking on race, culture, Islam, Christianity in Africa, and the diaspora. This intellectual biography makes explicit Blighting's role as an African public intellectual and conceptualizes the spaces in which he operated as public spheres. It also highlights his adoption and use of an Afro-positivist discourse in the public arenas of West Africa, Victorian England, and the United States, among others. So the book shows how Islam was in fact a bridge to Blighting's West African Ethiopianism. Through his involvement with West African Muslims, I pass it, he was able to accept, engage, and articulate the epistemologies that define African societies and cultural traditions. By analyzing Blighting's lived experience in Africa, this book brings fresh scholarship to understanding his moments of transformation, for example, his abandonment of a diasporic Ethiopianist attitude towards indigenous Africans following his cathartic connection with them while serving in the Liberian militia, and his encounters with the African Muslim civilizations of the Greater Senegambia. These events prompted his study of Arabic, his examination of original and a conscientious research of Islamic manuscripts, and engagement with Islamic scholars and their communities. The book argues that Blyden was one of the first, if not the first, Black African scholar to be engrossed by the systematic and scientific study of Islam in West Africa. And I show how Blyden's methodological engagement with West African Islam prompted an increasing respect for African societies and cultures, leading to his final transformation reflected in his last book, African Life and Customs, as well as in the distinctive brand of West African Ethiopianism that he inspired. Ultimately, Blyden came to believe that Africa's regeneration was to come from within rather from outside change. Blyden was born to free Black parents in St. Thomas, Danish West Indies on August 3rd, 1832. At the age of 10, Blyden and his family briefly moved to Porto Cabello, Venezuela. They returned to St. Thomas in 1844. When Blyden returned to St. Thomas, he was attending school in the morning while working as an apprentice in a tailoring shop. Blyden also studied privately with his mother, Judith Blyden, as a school teacher. It was, however, Reverend Knox of the Dutch Reformed Church of St. Thomas that would influence Blighting to travel to the United States in an attempt to attend theological college at Rutgers University. Due to the exigencies of the time, Blighting was unsuccessful in his bid to attend various schools in the US. So rather than be a servant in a New York home, he joined the Back to Africa movement and immigrated to Monrovia, Liberia, to acquire an education that he could not get in the US and to escape the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. In Monrovia, Blighting attended Alexander High School, where he would later serve as principal. And from Liberia, Blighting would travel the world articulating and confronting various concerns of Black life. Throughout his travels, Blighting was a voice of conscience and an agent of resistance for people of African descent throughout the world. Thus, from his base in Monrovia, Liberia, and later Freetown, Sierra Leone, Blighting loomed large as an African public intellectual in the scholarly and nationalist atmosphere of global Black life in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Today, my presentation is based on the 5th chapter of my book. That chapter attempts to go beyond the popular understanding of Blighting's association with Islam to examine his pioneering role in the systematic study of Islam in West Africa. Utilizing an Atlantic framework, it explores the reciprocal relationship that developed between Blighting and the Muslim communities and intellectuals of the greater Senegambian region of West Africa. Further, it shows the symbiotic relationship that developed between Blighting and the Muslim peoples of the region, as well as his careful study of Arabic and other West African languages. It also takes account for his various travels in the interior of the Senegambian region as he collected and historicized original manuscripts written by West African Muslims. Blighting, a trained Presbyterian minister, pioneered the study of Islam and Islamic societies in Africa. Through his commitment, he recognized and articulated the indigenization of Islam in West Africa, and yet has not been given the due recognition for his contributions to the academic study of Islam. The chapter also shows Blighting's interaction with leaders and institutions and how they held him in high regard for his scholarship and his attempt to accurately depict Africa as experienced by African people. I'm going to start on Ethiopianism. Ethiopianism can generally be described as the Afro-Christian belief or sentiment among African diasporans and maybe some Africans, especially Blacks in the United States, that their enslavement in the Americas was God's providential plan for Africa to experience a renaissance. This reawakening in industrial technologies, business, and world affairs was to be organized and led by African-American returnees to Africa, who, having experienced Western culture, had been divinely ordained to civilize and Christianize their native king. It was a providential theology that placed American Blacks at the center of African Black political liberation and spiritual regeneration. Such sentiments can be traced from the 18th century poetry of Phyllis Whitley through the activities of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA in the 19th and early 20th centuries to the contemporary beliefs of Rastafarians who believe in both a physical and a spiritual return to Zion, that is Africa. Blighting was influenced by these ideas. And as a result, before he arrived in Liberia, Blighting had unfortunately bought into the civilizing missionary ideas about US whites and Blacks who, quote, believed that God and his large providence had been preparing the American Negro to assume a hand in the evangelization of Africa, end quote. Consequently, when the Liberia packet landed at Grand Bassa County, Liberia on January 25, 1851, one young man aboard the vessel, Edward Blyden, was filled with Ethiopianist rhetoric and wont to versify. In a letter to his sponsors in the US, Blyden praised the supposed African fathers of Christendom, valorizes the land of his ancestors, and declares his patriotism for the second independent country in Africa, Liberia. It was Ethiopianism, Back to Africa, and the dawn of African nationalism all rolled into one. Blighting's missionary zeal was balanced by a sense of nationalism. He captured his nationalistic and Back to African sentiments in a poem he published in the New York Colonization Journal. Thus, at a young age and early period of his life in Liberia, he was given to expression, passion, and pathos in a prosaic nationalism to inspire the Back to Africa movement. However, accompanying these notions of Ethiopianism, Back to Africa sentimentality, and nationalism among diasporan Blacks was an aloofness and condescension about native African ways of life. Such arrogance is immediately evident in Blighting's narration of his arrival in Africa. He writes while on board the Liberia packet that, quote, in a few minutes, the deck was thronged by natives, large, robust, intelligent-looking men with no other clothing than a rag tied around their waist. Many of them had a tolerable smattering of the English language, end quote. Blyden would, as a result of his diasporic Ethiopianist background, quickly join the American immigrants' fight against the disdain for the natives of Liberia. In a letter written to his mentor, J.P. Knox, Blyden records, and I quote, 300 citizens who some time ago started from here under the command of President Roberts to fight a tribe of crewmen who some time previously murdered several citizens of Basako and attacked the settlements with the intention of taking it, have returned with the loss of but 4 men, having conquered and subdued more than 2,000 of the enemy. Surely God is on our side. His name be praised. Classic Ethiopianism. Blyden's expression of this cavalier attitude that had been adopted by the American settlers toward the native peoples of Liberia epitomized the struggle against the different ethnic groups already living in Liberian territory. If Blyden was ready to go to war on behalf of the Americo-Liberian immigrants, he got his chance in 1853 when the Liberian government embarked on an expedition to Little Cape Mount to arrest Chief Bombo of the Vai ethnic group. Blyden remembers, quote, having suffered considerably from fatigue and still feeling himself amply repaid by the scenes he witnessed and the experience he gained in the wearisome route. Blyden's opinion of indigenous Liberians was not limited to the military field. In an 1852 letter, he opines, the influence of Liberia upon the surrounding tribes is very happily manifesting itself. Even the crewman who some years ago, proud of customs and habits of his ancestors, disdained all imitation of civilized life and rigorously persecuted his neighbor, the native mind is undergoing a complete revolution. There exists among many of them the belief that great day is approaching for Africa, some year of golden harvest. Again, classic Ethiopianism. However, at some point in his stay in Liberia, Blyden would abandon the civilizing mission against the habits and crewmen and customs of the crewmen's ancestors. This change in his attitude began around the presidency of Stephen Allen Benson. In 1856, Blyden was once again part of a military expedition and a captain in the militia as aide-de-camp to the general. Blyden records his experience of the expedition. Quote, Mr. Benson succeeding to Roberts's disastrous aboriginal policy to enter upon an expensive war, carrying 2,000 men into the field with the Kru tribes. We traversed nearly the whole of Sinu country and destroyed scores of towns, but though merely a boy then, I regretted the waste of men and material to subdue and humble a people who only claimed to live as men in their own country. But this was Benson's inheritance from Roberts's rule, end quote. This fundamental modification of Blyden's perspective from a civilizing mission to an indigenous African point of view would characterize his subsequent writings. And although there still remain strands of superior attitude towards indigenous Africans in his writing, Blyden successfully deculturalized some of his Ethiopianist positions compared to some of his diaspora counterparts. On September 6, 1871, Edward Blighting, a new resident at Freetown, Sierra Leone, reports that an embassy of 9 leading Muslim old men from Fula town gave him a formal welcome. These Muslims blessed him in Arabic, ending with the Barakat al-Nabi, blessings of the Prophet. Blighting in turn informed them of his reason for coming to Sierra Leone, that is, quote, the word of God, his truth, should spread over all Africa, that he might teach the Arabic language to young men who are to be the future teachers and Christian missionaries that they may be able to understand the Muslim ulamas and carry the word of God to Futa, Jene, and Timbuktu, end quote. This meeting marked a watershed moment in the reciprocal relationship that continued to develop between Blighting and the Muslim communities of the Upper Guinea region, which spans modern-day Liberia, Sierra Leone, parts of Eastern Guinea, and northwestern Ivory Coast. According to Blighting, the group of men of 9 who called on him saw him as, quote, chosen of God, and began to call him Mukhtar, that is the chosen one, in contrast to Abdul Karim, which name had been given to him for his work among Muslims in the interior of Liberia. I examined Blighting's study of Islam in West Africa during the 19th century and argue that he is the intellectual progenitor of the notion of Africans making Islam their own, an idea now popularized by the phrase Africanization of Islam. As a Presbyterian trained minister, his stance on Islam and its redeeming qualities for African people earned him many enemies in the Christian and British colonial establishment who falsely accused him of having converted to Islam. I will systematically detail his specific contributions to the study of Islam in the areas of Islamic scholarship, Arabic and African languages, the institutionalization of Arabic English schools, and his own cultural immersion in Muslim African societies. I show Blighting's systematic study of the spread, localization, and practice of Islam among Muslim Africans. I might not be able to do all of this in this presentation, but I'll see how far I can go. Now, since the 13th century, non-Muslims, nominal Muslims, Muslim clerics, traders, merchants, landlords, and craftsmen, along with religious and educational specialists of the greater Senegambian region, had through intermarriage, conquest, and political alliance been seeking commercial relationships, political space, and spreading Islam to the region's Atlantic seaboard communities. The cross-cultural encounter that ensued between the inland and coastal communities further accelerated with the formation of the colonies of Freetown, Sierra Leone, and Cape Mersardo in what would become Liberia in 1821. Blighting, for instance, observes that formerly enslaved or recaptive Yoruba domiciled in Freetown indebted their Muslim faith to, quote, the intelligence, zeal, and energy, end quote, of Fula clerics from the interior. Furthermore, quote, many of the Akumo Mohammedans who have acquired some means by traffic send their sons to Futa Jalon to be educated in the language and religion of Arabia, end quote. Within this intellectual, political, and social milieu, he commenced a dynamic relationship with Upper Guinea's Muslim communities, specifically those in modern-day Liberia and Sierra Leone. Blighting, a lifelong autodidact, increasingly sought to understand African communities and institutions following his repatriation from the West Indies in 1851. Blighting's continued quest for knowledge and his subsequent arrival in Sierra Leone coincided with Upper Guinea Muslims' clerics' search for an intellectual connection with the Atlantic world. As a result of his aim to quote, establish Christian schools in the great Mohammedan centers, end quote, in the interior, a dialectical relationship ensued between him and the region's leading intellectuals and communities. For instance, one of the Muslim scholars, Alpha Suleiman, who was also an imam of Fura Bay College, advised Blyden that it was best to translate the Bible into Fula by using Ajami, because of West Africans' familiarity with it through trade, the mosque, and school. This burgeoning relationship between Blighting and the Muslim communities of the Senegambia not only impacted his intellectual views of Islam, but correspondingly influenced the growth of Muslim intellectual communities throughout West Africa, notably in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Nigeria. The relationship stimulated exchanges between the Muslim communities in West Africa and the Ummah in Great Britain, as well as Syria and Turkey in the Mediterranean. From these interactions, Blighting's study of Islam brought him to a better understanding of the history of human movement in Africa, including Africans' engagement with cultures other than their own. Specifically, he attained an understanding of the dynamic engagement of varying cultures within and outside the African continent. Blighting came to understand that African autonomy and agency mediated the inflow of Arabic and Mediterranean cultures into Africa that transformed their indigenous social, political, and religious institutions. Blighting's initial aim was to use Arabic in the propagation of the Christian gospel among West African Muslims. In his own words, quote, "The Christian Negro confronting and working with the Mohammedan Negro will do more than any other human instrumentality in this country to supersede the crescent by the cross," end quote. This statement demonstrates Blighting's Christianizing goals through the use of Arabic. Ironically, it was during this period that he published several essays on Islam, including Islam and Race Distinctions, Mohammedanism and the Negro Race, and Mohammedans of the Negritia, which drew accusations of sacrilege from contemporaneous Christian advocates. Blighting was therefore in many ways deserving of his 19th century European colleague, Mary Kingsley's description of him as a Black Arabic scholar par excellence. In May 1905, the Sultan of Turkey rewarded Blighting with a decoration of the Imperial Order of the Medjidiyeh. This award recognized his contributions to Muslim education, that is, modern Islamic schools or English Arabic schools in West Africa. This recognition was significant because it was the highest class of award that a civilian could receive from Sultan Abdul Hamid Khan, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, who laid claim at the time to be the Caliph and commander of the faithful, the political and spiritual leader of the Ummah. Sultan Abdul Majid I originally instituted the order in 1851 to reward British and French army personnel who had helped the Ottoman Empire during the Crimean War against Russia. Blighting's letters, the sentiments from his contemporaries, the award by the Sultan of Turkey, and the commendations by his peers all testify to Blighting's contribution to the systematic study of West African Muslim societies. In addition, they show the painstaking travels, training, and translation Blighting undertook in pursuit of an understanding of West African societies. Plus, it is evident that Blighting pioneered the establishment of what became known as Arabic English schools in West Africa, which combined Western education with Islamic Arab instruction. So, according to Blighting, the quote, "the Oriental aspect of Islam was largely modified in Africa through this undertaking of the localization of Islam." Blighting advocated the localization of Christianity in West Africa. After Blighting's study of Islam as practiced in Africa, he began to compare his observations of Africanized Islam with Christianity as taught to Africans by European missionaries. In Blighting's comparative analysis, he came to the conclusion that African Christians were docile, servile, and blind imitators of European Christianity. Quote, "all tendencies to independent individuality were repressed and destroyed. Their ideas and aspirations could be expressed only in conformity with the views and taste of those who held rule over them. All avenues to intellectual improvement were closed against them, and they were doomed to perpetual ignorance," end quote. In other words, African Muslims, when compared to their Christian counterparts, were independent of Arab Muslims, and their ideas and motivations were distinct from the Arabic peoples who introduced Africans to Islam. It was on this basis that Blighting advocated and influenced the emergence of indigenous African church movement in West Africa. Blighting, through his call for European education and Christianity to be adapted to local African conditions, had prefigured Kwame Nkrumah's attempted synthesis of the best aspects of Euro-Christian ideas, Islamic civilization, and African humanism in his book, Philosophical Conscientism. Ali Masri further expounds on Blighting and Nkrumah's ideas on Islam, Christianity, and Africa in his famous Triple Heritage documentary series and in subsequent lectures on Pan-Africanism in the era of globalization. This is one of the reasons Blighting is considered to have authored the first sophisticated explanation of Pan-Africanism, which was later embraced by Nkrumah and more recently by Masri. However, fewer academics and Pan-African enthusiasts are aware of Blighting's specific contributions to the systematic study of Islam in West Africa. Glocalization and Africanizing Islam. To explain the two stages of African agency that Blighting identifies in the Africanization of Islam, I employ the conceptual term glocalization. Glocalization recognizes globalization as a simultaneous process of universalizing and particularizing rather than a system where one party is globalizing and the other party is simply on the receiving end of an exchange of goods or ideas. Globalization is therefore the reciprocal process of the externalization and localization of an idea, product, or phenomenon, and in this particular instance, religion. So one can talk about localized Islam, the simultaneous spread or externalization of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula to other parts of the world beginning in the 7th century, which was accompanied by a localization of Islam wherever it gained a foothold. Thus, in the areas of the world where Islam found traction, Islam took on an indigenous character, reflecting more of the cultural sensibilities of the local population and less of Islam as practiced in the Arabian Peninsula. Blighting describes this African agency or process of globalization, beginning with its externalization to West Africa, as follows, and I quote, "There are numerous Negro Mohammedan communities and states in Africa which are reliant, productive, self-reliant, productive, independent, and dominant, supporting without the countenance or patronage of the parent country, Arabia, whence they derive them, their political, literary, and ecclesiastical institutions. In Sierra Leone, the Mohammedans, without any aid from government, imperial or local, or any contributions from Mecca or Constantinople, erect their mosque, keep up their religious services, conduct their schools, and contribute to the support of missionaries from Arabia, Morocco, or Futa when they visit them," end quote. Blyden goes on to summarize the globalization process as, quote, "The Arab superstructure has been superimposed on a permanent indigenous substructure so that what really took place when the Arab met the Negro in his own home was a healthy amalgamation and not an absorption or undue repression," end quote. Thus, while Blyden did not coin the term Africanization, he certainly was the first scholar to begin a systematized study of Islam as practiced in Africa. He provides fresh insights into the study of Islam in Africa, even as he used it for his Pan-African agenda. Blyden's contributions to the systematic study of Islam includes his analysis of Arabic and African languages and literature, Muslim African historiography, Islam and Islamic scholarship in Africa, and English-Arab education, as well as his cultural immersion in African Muslim communities. Now, time will not allow me to go into all of this, but I will attempt to do some of it. So in his zeal to study Islamic African societies, Blyden began with Arabic and then turned to Fula. However, prior to his study of Arabic, he was familiar with the languages in Oriental scholarship, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. With this acquisition of Arabic, Blyden became a full-fledged Black Orientalist who could employ an African-centered Orientalist discourse to illuminate African histories and cultures. Because Blyden received his early education while living in Liberia and West Africa, he balanced his Orientalist training with his day-to-day experiences with Muslim African societies. His Orientalist discourse and orientation to Africa was therefore fundamentally different from that of his Orientalist colleagues, Christian, European, and African diasporan. Blyden's African-centered Orientalism was shaped by his travels and stays in Islamic centers of learning in Egypt, Syria, and Kankan, the famous Islamic city of West Africa. Moreover, he was influenced during his tenure at Liberia College, where he institutionalized the study of Arabic and correspondingly invited African clerics to study and translate Islamic documents. It was as a result of these actions that African Muslims gave Blyden the sobriquet Mukhtar, that is the chosen one. Ever the consummate scholar and linguist, Blyden began his Islamic studies by taking a linguistic pilgrimage to the Syrian Protestant College in Beirut, Syria in 1866. The same year, he traveled through Egypt and Jerusalem. Blyden explained the purpose for going to Syria as follows, quote, "The other day while on a visit to a native town, I met a couple of itinerant Mohammedan priests with their books and papers. They could not speak a word of English. I wrote an Arabic passage from the Quran from memory. They read it and raised their hands in astonishment that I should know anything of the language. They then showed me their papers, but I was not sufficiently acquainted with the language to read them. But I hope by perseverance to be able to learn that and several other native languages. Evidently, this encounter with Muslim clerics in the interior of Liberia was a critical moment in his quest for Arabic fluency and knowledge of Islam. The meeting is also evidence of Muslim clerics' desire to spread Islam in the Atlantic belt of the greater Senegambian region of West Africa. At this time, Blighting already spoke Spanish and Dutch, but likewise was interested in teaching Arabic at Liberia College. He therefore set aboard Captain Thomas Milbourne's screw steamer, the Pioneer, on May 11, 1866, en route to Liberia to study Arabic. On July 16, he arrived in the port of Beru and traveled 12 miles inland to the Protestant College in Abia on July 19th. Blighting returned from his studies to teach Arabic at Liberia College later on in 1872, while variously as a linguist at Fora Bay College and as an agent of the colonial government of Sierra Leone. Blighting helped champion the creation of an Arabic translation bureau. He even proposed sending 2 young translators to the Syrian Protestant College, where he himself had studied. He hired 2 translators, Mohammed Waka and Mohammed Sanusi, who would later be hired into the service of the British colonial government on Blighting's recommendation. Sanusi first met Blighting on one of his first visits to Fula Town, Sierra Leone. According to Blighting, Sanusi, who was an Aku Mohammedan, had been educated at Futajalon by a Fula teacher. Sanusi made a great impression on Blighting, and when he expressed interest in Arabic translations of the New Testament. When Blighting met Sanusi, the latter was already literate in Arabic and English. To Blighting, he was an example of how the Christian clergy were ignorant of the intellectual abilities of African Muslims. It was Sanusi and one Suleiman and an Imani Ratib who actually set up a study plan for him to learn Fula. In addition, Sanusi helped with his translation of African language texts on Islam. In addition to his government appointment as a linguist, Sanusi, and now Blighting's mentee, taught Arabic at Fora Bay College, and because of his translation skills, became an important medium of exchange between West African Muslims and the British Muslim community of Liverpool, who published The Crescent and Islamic World. Drawing from both his Orientalist training and Middle East and African oral traditions, Blighting additionally took his time to describe the literary character of the Quran and how Africans put his prosaic qualities to oral use. Blighting debated most of his contemporary writings on classical studies, Islam as religion and Islam as practice in Africa, as well as Oriental culture. Notably, these scholars including Bosmo Smith of Trinity College, Said Amir Ali Moluvi of the Inner Temple, J. Addison Alexander of Princeton, and Professor Draper of New York University. Blighting was without doubt conversant with the existing body of scholarship on Islam as he was on Christianity. He used his knowledge of West African Muslim communities to contest Herbert Spencer's views on African intellectual and organizational abilities. He was quick to point out in his review of Smith's work on Islam that many Muslim West African communities were self-reliant, arguing that Islam had transformed rather than totally changed indigenous African practices. Blighting's paramount involvement, as far as Islam was concerned, was less with Oriental Islam and more with Islamic Africa. In his contribution to the scholarly discourse on West African Islam between 1871 and 1905, Blighting wrote at least 5 articles. These include Mohammedanism in West Africa, Mohammedanism and the Negro race, and the Quran in Africa. The central theme of Blighting's writing is the indigenous character of Islam in Africa, or Africanized Islam.
Yes, Harry.
So at this time, I'd like to bring my presentation to a close and give an opportunity for other people to ask questions. But this is a map of Blighting's travel to the interior and his engagement with people in the interior of Sierra Leone and Liberia. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so very much. That was fascinating. So we can only upload virtually, unfortunately. Thank you so very much for this detailed presentation. It's fascinating stuff. And I think many of our attendees today have had their own dealings with Blyden in their own research. I'm thinking of Jeremy Dale and Sean Henrietta, but others might have encountered Blyden in approaching Islam in Africa and the history of how missionaries and Western scholars approached Islam in Africa in the late 19th century. Thank you so very much. So now the floor is open to questions. So we decided that you can raise your hand if you have a question for Ari on this presentation or on the reminder of the book if you had read the book, or if you have any clarification or comments or yeah. So who wanna go first? Yeah, I'm expecting to see some hands. Otherwise, I'll have my ask my own question. So
I think there's a question from Abdul Basit Kasim.
All right.
Sean also has his hand up.
Yes, I saw him now. Okay. Abdul Basit, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Harry, for the presentation. I just have one question. What do you think is the intellectual contribution of Blyden to the debate or the tension between the Africanization of Islam and Black Orientalism? Because of this, there's actually been this constant debate on how to Africanize Islam and the old debate around Black Orientalism. But reading Blyden, the way you're presenting him now, I actually see him as a bridge builder, as someone whose thoughts can actually bridge this tension in this polarizing way of interpreting Islam in Africa. I don't know if you have anything to say about that. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I think that Blyden's contributions to that debate would be one of African agency, and he would advocate for Islam as practiced by Africans in their own cultural and distinctive ways. And so that is where he will fall on that side of the debate, I think.
All right. I hope that answers your question. Next.
I think Sean had his hand up.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I'm too technologically incompetent to figure out how to. I can clap, but I can't figure out how to raise my hand on the Zoom thing. Normally, there's a button, but I'm not finding the button today. Thank you, Harry. This is really great. There was something about the way that you presented, particularly Blyden's relationship with Sanusi and Blyden's connection to the British colonial administration that had not really occurred to me while reading your book, and it just sort of set off a chain of ideas that I guess I'd like to get your thoughts on. Between the story that you just recounted and Blyden's relationship with Maurice Delafosse, it's kind of interesting to think about Blyden not only as a pioneer in the academic study of Islam in Africa, but also in some ways as a kind of pioneer of the process of what David Robinson, called the sort of paths of accommodation. And insofar as, those paths of accommodation were themselves constitutive of the production of European language scholarship about Islam in Africa. I mean, I wonder, should we make Blyden, in a sense, kind of the first author of British and French Islamic policy in West Africa? Again, something that just sort of occurred to me, the way that you framed that particular part of the story in this presentation. I know it's kind of a provocation, but I'm just
that's an interesting.
How you respond to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I never thought about it that way, but I think that's significant. And I think in the book I also talk about Blyden's naivety, right, in thinking that, well, the British, through the Church Missionary Society's activities in Sierra Leone, were eventually going to hand over the reins of government to Africans, and and so Blyden really believed in that, and I think that's why he contributed to some of these policies within West Africa, and even preferring that the British will be in charge in when the British had, you know, border disputes with the French in Sierra Leone and so forth. But as far as him being, I think I'll probably have to go back and read the documents a little bit more closely. But yes, I think one of the ways in which I describe Blighting is as an African-centered Orientalist scholar, right? And I think that because of his lived experience and his encounters with these Muslim communities, he had a kind of a different perspective than his Orientalist colleagues during this time period. But at the same time, I think that we can still say that he was a mediator, right? He was a mediator of the sort of interaction and intellectual exchanges between those in West Africa and those that you can describe in the Ummah in Britain and in Syria and Turkey. And that's the reason for which he was awarded the medal. And so I think that is emblematic of his contribution to that discourse between Orientalist and West African scholars. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's what I think about it right now.
Sean?
Thank you. Yeah, that's great, Harry. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Sean.
Excellent. So next is Zachary Wright.
Thank you, Professor Harry, for such a marvelous presentation. I'm really struck by the way in which Blyden really kind of seems to avoid this kind of center periphery argument that is kind of at the center of Islam noir and these other kind of even later Orientalist readings of Islam in Black Africa. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that. Does he, at least in the way you presented it so far, does he weigh in on questions of Islamic orthodoxy, the practice or theology of Black African Muslims in relationship to the Arab counterparts being, you know, in any way less or perhaps more authentic? Does he weigh in on questions of Islamic authenticity at all, or how would you answer that? But thanks.
I don't think that I came across anything that where Blighting talks about authenticity. I think that Blighting engages with. I think that Blighting engages with the acceptance of Islam in Africa, but you have to understand that this is Blighting's agenda. Blighting's agenda is about his African personality. Blighting's agenda is about African regeneration. Blighting's agenda is about all of these things that should come from within Africa. And so I think he's less concerned about orthodoxy and more concerned about, I think, in Sean's work, Sean has a book chapter on relativism and Blighting's contributions to that discourse. And I think that Blighting will be more of a relativist than somebody who was advocating for orthodoxy. Yes, Rebecca.
Rebecca has a question?
Sorry, I couldn't find my hand raise either. So thank you very much. This is a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask about, you said that when Blyden first arrived in Sierra Leone, he was told by the Imam of Fourabay College that he ought to translate the Bible into Fula Ajami. Did I get that correct?
Yes.
Did that happen, to your knowledge?
Not that I know of. I'm not sure that ever happened. But Blighting was very successful. I think he published a number of articles on Ajami articles or Ajami text. He would publish a number of articles on Ajami text, but not on the translation of the Bible.
Okay, so he was fluent in Fula Ajami.
Yes.
He became fluent. Okay, thank you.
We still have.
Sorry,
yes.
I think he would later, one of his final publications was the a plea for transliteration, right? The Arabic Bible. And so that actually signifies that it had not been done, and Blighting was actually looking for the best way that the Bible will be transliterated into Arabic. I think Sean does some work on that, so maybe Sean can speak better to it than I can.
Sean has a lot to say.
I think you're right. I think you're right, Harry. I don't think that the Fula, the Ajami translation was ever made. I mean, that piece on transliteration was responding to the American University of Beirut's Arabic translation of the Bible, which was circulating broadly in West Africa at the time. That was the main thing that was being used to try to convert Muslims in that region, and he was deeply critical of how they had translated the Bible. But yeah, as far as I know, the Ajami version never went anywhere.
All right, Team White.
Thank you, sir. Could you address the relationship between the Blyden Muslim relationship and slavery? My understanding is that especially among the Vai people in Cape Mount and southwestern Liberia, there was a history of enslavement by Vai people. How do the clerics and enslavement and Blyden intersect?
All right. So in the book, I actually engage with the Bilali rebellion. And in that Bilali rebellion, Blighting becomes sort of a peacemaker and actually gets the British colonial government to sort of intervene, because Bilali it was a rebellion against enslavement, and the basis of the rebellion was sort of based on Islamic principles of freedom and who could be enslaved and who could not be enslaved, and so there was tension, and Blighting was the one who gets the two warring parties to bring an end to hostilities, and so I think that Blighting's contribution there would have been like understanding that because he was initially opposed to Bilali's rebellion, right? But when he came to understood that they were based on Islamic principles, that's when he intervened. That's when he got the British to also intervene. I'm not sure if that's a good enough answer. Mm-hmm.
Right? You have
Thank you so much for such a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. One thing I like about the work is how you systematically show the ways in which Blyden's thoughts and ideas are evolving as he comes to Africa. I wanted to know if Blyden's concept of African personality changes along with him, and what does African personality mean in the different spaces in which he's working, and how that is also changing throughout his research. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bright. Well, I think the African personality comes out of one of his last texts, which is African Life and Customs, and in which Blighting attempts to understand certain African practices, social customs and traditions and so forth. And so actually African personality, I think, was the part of the apex of his thinking, or the apex of his transformation, right? From what I described as sort of this providential theology that Blighting had, to one where he was talking about a regeneration within Africa, and not the regeneration coming from outside, but the regenerations coming from within Africa. And it's the same way that he explains the African personality as something that had not come out, but needs to come out, right? And that's how he formulated this notion of the African personality. but as far as his evolution and its connection to Islam, I think that I've already explained some of the earlier transformations in terms of what happens when he changes his mind about Americo-Liberian interaction with native Liberians. But the ultimate type of transformations happens because of Islam and his encounter with what he perceived to be the Africanization of Islam, right? And based on that, that is when he would begin to advocate for the Africanization of the Christian church, right? And so Blighting begins to lead what becomes West African Ethiopianism, which is to see African churches led by African Christians to be singing African songs, dressing in African clothes, and so forth, and to speak in African languages. And so that is part of, all of that is part of Blighting's sort of evolution as far as the African personality was concerned.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Harry. So at this point, I think we need to leave it there.
Jeremy Dell has a question, if there's still time.
Who? Jeremy. Oh, okay. All right.
I think it's a good question to close on, actually.
Okay.
So thank you, Professor Harry, for this wonderful presentation and the book. I just want to know, because I didn't catch the introductions, what are you working on now? Did this research kind of lead you to future projects that we can look forward to?
Sure. Well, I'm interested in African intellectual history, and I think that currently that there's not there are people who are publishing in African intellectual history, but we don't have a corpus or a canon of literature that has been identified and say, this is the historiography, this is the canon of African intellectual history. And so I think Blighting contributes to that canon, and I'm working on Carl Christian Reindorf, who wrote the Gold Coast and Ashanti, one of the earliest texts written by an African about an African society during the 1860s to the 1880s. So I'm working on him as the next African intellectual, and looking at his contributions to the founding of African studies, because in recent sort of discourse about African studies, especially in the United States, we've been looking at the founders of the African studies field, whether it's the Heskovits or whether it's the African-American contributors to the founding of the field. But not a lot has been spoken about the African contributions by Blyden, by Reindorf, by Ajayi, Crowder, and other people, and what their specific contributions to the founding of the field were. So I'm going to be looking at Reindorf in that regard.
Great, looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Harry. So thank you so much to Harry and our audience for joining us today. And we, of course, might upload him virtually or actually. And please join us again March 10th for Ariya Khan's talk about her new book and her talk on West African literary autobiographies of West Africans in the Caribbean. On that, I would like to thank our speakers and our audience, and see you on March 10th. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
A pleasure. It's our pleasure. This was fascinating.
All right.